Goblin Squire Investigates. Hi everyone, and welcome to Goblin Squire Investigates, where I bring together my experience as a miniature painter with my professional background as a researcher to answer your questions about miniature painting. Before we go any further, if you like the video and you'd like to see more, do click that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the little bell so that you're notified when new videos come out. Drop me a comment, that would be awesome. If you have any questions that you'd like to see answered on these videos, just drop it in the comments or get in touch with me through any of the other platforms that I'll put below the video. So, without further ado, we'll get on with today's question. And the question for today is, what are the different types of 3D printing which are used for miniatures? I know there are different types, but don't know anything about them. Well, the person asking the question this week is absolutely right. There are different types of 3D printing. So in this video, I will talk about the different types and explain what they're used for and their kind of strengths and weaknesses. So I'll start off by looking at each type in turn. And the first thing I'll be looking at is filament printing. So printing using filament on a filament 3D printer. I'll then look at resin printing. Again, using a different type of printer and using a different material for the printing process itself. Once I've looked at each process, I will look at the strengths and weaknesses of each, how they lend themselves to different types of printing within miniature painting and indeed more generally. And I'll also look at some examples of each type of 3D printing. I'm fortunate enough to have access to both, so I can show you what comes from each type of 3D printer and how we can use them in our miniature painting, in our games, in all of the ways that we can benefit from this great technology. So in the next two sections, I'm going to be talking about some of the technical aspects of printing, some of the practicalities and the technology. If you don't think of yourself as a very technical person, don't worry. I'm going to try and cut out as much of the jargon and unnecessary complication as I can and explain it to you in a fairly simple way. If you still think this isn't for you, hold fire with me. I will be talking through the benefits and the drawbacks of each type of 3D printing in just a minute, and we'll get on to seeing some examples at that point. So first of all, I'm going to talk about filament printing. Both types of printing have a few different names, which I'll kind of explain to you in case you come across different things. Filament printing is also called FDM printing, fused deposition and modeling printing, which just kind of talks about the technical aspect of how it's done. But if you see FDM printing, that's what it's talking about. It's also sometimes called PLA printing. PLA is the material which is most commonly used for it, which is why it's called that. Technically, you can use different materials. I'm just going to talk about it as filament printing because it's the easiest way for us to really understand what's going on. And here is some of the filament that we're talking about. And as you can see here, this is just a spool of very thin plastic. And what you do with this is you push the filament into the machine. The machine itself has some very hot parts, so you have to be a little bit careful while it's printing. But as the filament gets fed through, it gets melted within the machine in a very controlled way, of course, and pushed through the nozzle at the end. It gets pushed onto the build plate at the bottom, or onto more plastic as it's building up. And it cools once it's pushed out. And the very precise pattern of the machine means that you get the very accurate model that you're looking to build. You can see a time-lapse video here. So you can see that the nozzle is moving around. It's depositing the melted filament down, and it's slowly building up layers to get what you're looking for. Once you've got it started, it's very easy. You can walk away. But it does take a long time. This process that I've got going on here, I printed earlier in the week. It's parts of a cart which all come together. This took 36 hours in total. So it is a long process. Hence, I've done some time lapse because I didn't want to show you just at normal speed where you see very little happening. You'll also see there's a bit of a gap in the middle because I did take a sleep during the 36 hours. And I thought I would take short videos just so you can really see what's going on. But you get the idea that this filament is being passed through the machine, melted, and then it cools and slowly builds up into the model that you're looking to build over a long period of time. So this is all based on temperature, really, melting and cooling of plastic into the shape that you want it to be. So the second type of printing is what I've referred to as resin printing, because it uses this stuff. This is liquid resin in a bottle, very different from the filament that we saw before. You might also see this referred to as DLP printing, which is digital light processing, which again is really more of just a description of what's happening. I haven't been able to get you a video of the Mini being built here because the digital light part refers to the fact that this resin actually reacts with ultraviolet light. So it reacts with everyday light, which contains ultraviolet, but you can also do it in a much more controlled way by shining just specifically ultraviolet light onto it. So that's what the 3D printer does. So all we do for this one is you fill up the reservoir with resin, you plug it, tell the 3D printer what you want to print, close it up, and then it actually starts raising the miniature out of the vat. So it solidifies very small sections using the light, and it raises up very slightly and then does it again, and that builds into a full miniature. And you can see here there is an image of what it looks like at the end. As I say, unfortunately I couldn't take a video of it in process, but you can kind of get the idea of how it works. So where the other type of printing used heat, it melted and then cooled the plastic. This just uses light. So you shine a light in very specific areas on resin which reacts to ultraviolet light, and that gives you the accuracy to build the model that you can see here. So that's the technical side of things. But what does this mean in practice for us as miniature painters, as hobbyists, whatever you might be coming to this video as? What do these offer us? What does one offer that the other doesn't, etc.? Well, I'm going to use some examples that I've printed myself to examine this in a bit more detail and talk about the strengths and weaknesses, because I still haven't quite got the light sorted out for videoing in here, hence I'm wearing the old cap to try and keep a bit of light off my face. I'm going to do this with a series of photos and talk you through them and hopefully help you to understand what you might use the different types of printing for. So I'm going to start off by looking at human-sized 32mm or 28mm scaled miniatures. And the example that you can see here is from my resin printer, and obviously I've painted it up once it's come off. But really, the detail and the quality here is excellent. I think it's indistinguishable from most of the plastic miniature manufacturers who are out there. This is nothing against them. I think this is great quality. I mean, I think you're looking at the quality of maybe a Games Workshop or a Reaper Mini, something like that. The quality is fantastic. They're great to print. There was very little cleanup involved here at all. I did deliberately choose a miniature, as I tend to do, which doesn't require supports, which are, as you can imagine with the printing process, as these things are coming along, if you're trying to print an area where there's nothing underneath it, it requires some kind of support to keep it up. I deliberately chose one which didn't require that because they're much easier to work with. And I really think that this looks great. I think the quality is fantastic. And yeah, I'd be very happy painting these, using these in my games. And here's an example from my filament printer. As you can see, it's not quite so good here. This is actually slightly larger than human scale, but you can see that there are some layers here which haven't fully come together. You can definitely see the result of the printing process here. In fairness, I would say there are some people who have managed to create slightly better 28 or 32mm miniatures from their filament printers than I have. It does at times feel a bit more like an art than a science, 3D printing. There are a lot of settings to get right. But in general, as a general rule, I would say that the filament printers aren't as good as resin printers at printing those really finely detailed, smaller miniatures. They are, a filament is cheaper than resin, so it is, there is a reason to use it for that. But I'll come on to the real strengths of filament printing in just a second. So I mentioned that filament was cheaper than resin, and that's one of the reasons it is perfect for printing out much larger pieces or terrain pieces. So I've got an example here. This is described as a gnomish submarine, which I've printed. And I think the quality here is excellent. This has come off the filament printer. It would be incredibly expensive to print something like this using resin. And actually, with the vast majority of home resin printers, it would be impossible because the build plate is that much smaller. You can physically make things which are larger using a filament printer. And when it comes to something this size, I think the filament is perfect because those tiny imperfections that show up so clearly on a 28 or 32 millimeter miniature are still there to a degree, but they are so much smaller in comparison to the overall figure. So this is a kind of bare printed filament miniature, and here is a piece of terrain which I have painted. This is a stone circle, and again you can see, if you look really closely, you can see that there are a few imperfections here, but this kind of thing simply wouldn't be possible with a resin printer, at least a home resin printer, and in a reasonable budget. So the differences are quite clear in the print in terms of quality, but also in terms of scale. And I think that each printer has its own strengths and weaknesses. So having looked at those example miniatures, as well as the techniques, the technical aspects behind 3D printing, I've definitely come to the conclusion that there are big differences, of course, between the two types of printing, but that both have a place within miniature painting, within hobbying. If you're looking for the humanoid figures, your kind of character figures, even your smaller monsters, you really can't beat a resin printer. But if what you're looking for is terrain or big monsters or vehicles, anything of that nature, then really what you want to be looking at is the filament printer. I'm very lucky to have both, so I can do both, and I do sell 3D printed miniatures, both painted and unpainted, through my website. So please do take a look if you're interested. But I hope you found this interesting and helpful, and now at least have a better idea of the two different types of printing and what they're used for. If you have enjoyed, please do like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all those good things. This is an ongoing series, so if you have any questions that you would like me to investigate, please do drop them in the comments below or get in touch with me through any of the other social media or through my website. In the meantime, I hope you have some great hobbying time and you love painting and gaming and all those things. Bye now.